Lectures on Biblical Greek. Chapter 35. At the end of this course on the basics of Biblical Greek, we have taken up athematic verbs, that is, verbs which do not have a theme vowel in the present active, verbs where the dictionary form ends in me, and so they're sometimes called me verbs. While one could memorize all the forms of this conjugation, we're focusing on 5 rules that allow us to identify the forms for the most part. Let's review those rules. Rule number 1, iota reduplication. In forming the present, and of course the imperfect, which is formed on the present, me verbs reduplicate the initial consonant and then place a iota in between. Not an epsilon, as in the perfect tense, but a iota. So seeing iota reduplication says this verb form is either present or imperfect. If there's an augment, it's imperfect. If there isn't, it's present. That's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is that these verbs are athematic in the present. They don't use a connecting vowel, omicron or epsilon. So in the example in front of you, the verbal root da is reduplicated di in the present, and then the personal ending is simply added, no connecting vowel. Did da men. However, in the imperfect, for example, the connecting vowels do return, as in the example of the second person singular. Augment, iota reduplication, the root, connecting vowel and ending, the vowel of the stem and the connecting vowel contract to omicron upsilon, giving us the form edidus. Rule number 2, athematic in the present. Rule number 3 identifies 3 new personal endings in the present active indicative: me, si, and asi. Me is first person singular, si is third person singular, and asi is third person plural. Si and asi are the ones that sort of cause confusion with students. So please memorize rule number 3, me, si, asi, as the 3 new endings. Rule number 4, that stem vowel can do some crazy things. It can lengthen, it can shorten, it can disappear. So when parsing a me verb, it's best not to pay attention to the stem vowel, other than enough to identify what the root is, but not for parsing's sake. So in the final example there, it doesn't matter what the vowel is between did and sigma. It's still second person singular present active indicative. The actual vowel is an omega. Rule number 4, the stem vowel can do some crazy things. And rule number 5 is that most me verbs use kappa alpha as their tense formative in the aorist. So although we're used to kappa alpha being in the perfect, one would also have to have epsilon reduplication to have a perfect. If there's just an augment, as in edoka, that's a kappa alpha aorist. In this particular lesson, we're going to make a few notes about the non-indicative forms of the me verbs using the paradigm of didomi. We'll then take up the question of conditional clauses and look at the 4 classes of conditions. And then lastly, a word or two about the optative. We're not going to learn the optative, but we're going to learn a couple of keys for identifying it. Here we go. The non-indicative forms of didomi. The subjunctive is identified by a lengthening of the connecting vowel. Of course, we don't have connecting vowels. Nonetheless, we get lengthening. Notice in all these forms the appearance of omega. The reduplicated stem is the only difference between the present and aorist subjunctive. So, dido and do, didos and dos, dido and do. By the way, those third person singular, present active subjunctive and third person singular aorist active subjunctive are also identical in form to the second person singular present middle passive subjunctive, and in the case of the aorist, the second person singular middle subjunctive. Only second-person active imperatives occur in the New Testament. And here, although the second-person plurals are fairly easy to identify, didote and dote, the second-person singulars are not. These need to be memorized. Didu is the second-person singular present active imperative, you singular, give. And dos is the aorist imperative, give. I sort of mock Microsoft here, the old Microsoft DOS, and that's how I remember it. Microsoft is always asking you to give them more money. I don't know if that mnemonic device will help you or not, but only the second person active imperatives occur in the New Testament. Infinitives are fairly straightforward with their nigh and sty endings or ani endings in the aorist passive. Of note is the aorist active infinitive, where instead of donai, it's do-nai. And that's an example of a crazy vowel, where we would expect remove the iota reduplication, you get the aorist. Well, the vowel changes slightly. The vowel can lengthen, shorten, or disappear. Remember, rule number 4. In the participles, the present active imparticiple and the aorist active imparticiple are identical except for iota reduplication. So the masculine singular present active the masculine singular present active participle and the aorist active masculine singular participle deduce and deuce. And once one knows the basic form, deduce, dedusa, dedon, dedontos, deduces, dedontos, it's pretty easy to see the aorist forms as well. So again, no surprises with the participles. Overall, the formation of the various non-indicative moods of didomi are reasonable to identify as one applies what one knows from thematic verbs to these athematic forms. The key is to look for iota reduplication in telling the difference between the present and the aorist. And do memorize those imperatives of the second person singular. Also in this lesson, we take up the full panorama of conditional clauses. In Greek, there are 4 types of conditional sentences, although there's a degree of overlap between these types. A conditional sentence consists of 2 parts: an if clause, called the protasis, and a then clause, called the apodosis. If A, then B. And conditional clauses generally work this way. If the protasis is true, the first part, then the apodosis is true. However, there's a bit more nuance than that, thus the 4 classes. We look at them in order. The first class are a condition of fact. The protasis is assumed true for the sake of argument. So if this is true, then the apodosis is true. They're typically A plus the indicative, or if it's negated by U, because we're assuming it's true. And the apodosis can be any mood. So in the example that is cited, Ede anastasis necron uk estin, ude Christos agegertai. If there is no resurrection of the dead, for the sake of argument, let's assume that's the case, then Christ has not been raised. That's a condition of fact. It's a first class. And notice in the protasis, it's A plus the indicative, estin, and then any mood can be used in the apodosis. The second class of conditions are what are sometimes called contrary to fact conditionals. And that's where the protasis is assumed to be false for the sake of argument. The previous one assumed to be true. Here it's assumed to be false. So if this, and we assume that that's false, then this. A plus the indicative in a past tense, negated by may, because this is an assumption, and on plus the indicative in the same tense as the protasis. So in the example, agar egnosan, for if they had known, they didn't, but if they had, see contrary to fact, uk an ton kyrion tes doxes estaurosan. If they had known, they didn't, but if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But in fact, they didn't know, and so they did, contrary to fact. That's this class of conditional. The third class of condition we have looked at previously. These conditionals are done with on plus the subjunctive in the protasis and then any mood or any tense in the apodosis. And generally there are two subdivisions here, future more probable. If something might happen, then this would be the consequences of it. Or what are called present general. That's generally true. So if the sun rises tomorrow, that's a generally true statement. Present in the apodosis, then the consequence. The example we have here, on theles dinasai me katharisai. If you wish, you are able to make me clean. So it's a future more probable. If you wish, notice on plus the subjunctive, you are able to make me clean. The fourth class of condition is where one raises an if-then clause that is only a remote possibility. And this class, it's very rare in the New Testament, but there are a couple of occasions, is A plus the optative mood, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then in the apodosis, on plus the optative. The example I'm going to cite only has the apodosis, the on clause, tenes elegen, to on theloi, that theloi there is an optative form, ha spermologos hutos legein. Tenes elegen, some were saying, or some kept saying, what would this babbler wish to be saying? The implied apodosis is, if he were to say anything, what would this babbler be saying? That's the sort of implied apodosis. We only have the protasis here, the on plus the optative clause. Again, these are very rare in the New Testament, but they do occasionally occur, these fourth classes, where it's A plus the optative, on plus the optative. We've looked at the four general classes of conditions, conditions of general conditions, contrary to fact conditions, conditions involving potentiality, and then the conditions that are only slightly possible. In the last case, the fourth class, optatives are used. So what is an optative? Optative is another mood of the Greek verb. As indicative, subjunctive, imperative, infinitive, participle, there's also the optative. Fortunately, there are only 68 examples of optatives in the entire New Testament, which is why we don't have you memorize any of the forms or test you on them. They occur primarily in Luke and Acts and Paul's writing. 15 of these 68 examples are the phrase me genoita, may it not happen. It's the least probable of the tenses. And if you negate the least probable, you are really hoping it won't happen. But in genoita, we see the identifiers of the optative. In the optative, in every person and number, omicron is the connecting vowel. There's no epsilon. And then following the omicron is iota, which functions as a mood formative. The presence of that iota there says this is an optative. The only thing you need to remember about identifying an optative is if there's a iota in a spot there really shouldn't be, it's probably an optative. Look it up in the chart. That's what I would recommend. I've laid out for you here the present first aorist and second aorist active optatives. And you'll notice each of the forms has a iota, and it's in a spot where you've not seen iotas before. So li oimi is the first person singular. May I loose, something like that. Again, these occur primarily in conditional clauses. But notice the iota. That's how to identify an optative. Again, the form that you'll run into most of the time is meg and oita. By no means, meg and oita spend time memorizing optative forms. Just remember, if it's got an extra iota in there, it's probably an optative. The non-indicative forms of ditto me are fairly easy to identify when one remembers general rules for formation of non-indicative forms and applies the 5 rules. Conditionals, there are 4 classes. Conditions of fact, conditions that are contrary to fact, conditions that are fairly probable, and conditions that aren't too probable.